Park Krausen, Artistic Director of the theater group Théâtre du Rêve in Atlanta. Welcome back.
Thanks.
It's been a year since we've seen you. What's been going on for you in the past year?
It's been a year of enormous growth, I would say. We basically went from doing a show or two a year with a piece that we developed for the High Museum, for the High Louvre Exchange, to doing 2 shows in Atlanta and 2 tours, 1 international and 1 national. So we've really grown leaps and bounds over the past year. And everything really centered around a piece that we commissioned a year ago, or actually 3 years ago, called Voir un ami pleurer, that was about the dynamic and ever-changing relationship between America and France and our ever-challenged identities.
You're a small local group. How have you managed, with the resources that you have, to expand like this?
That's a very good question. Well, yes, we are definitely homegrown in Atlanta and have been around for now 13 years. And I think it's really about 3 years ago we started to get really interested in cross-cultural dialogues through theater. So we started to work with artists from Belgium, from France, from Northern Africa, from Martinique as well, and it's really thanks to this kind of international dialogue that's going on that we were able to expand and get other parties interested, meaning people that helped us out financially, to help us travel abroad with it, and some funding coming from abroad as well. For example, our playwright and director were both Belgian, but the director has his own theater company in France, Voir un ami pleurer. So this director had worked previously with the Centre Wallonie-Bruxelles in Paris, France, which is right across from the Centre Georges Pompidou. And so he'd worked there, and he said, listen, I'm working on this really interesting collaboration with an American theater company, basically a French-American theater company, although all of our company members are Americans and currently live in Atlanta. He said, this project is really fascinating. It's about the relationship between France and America, written by a Belgian, directed by a Belgian playwright. Are you interested in doing it? So they actually provided most of the funding, or I'd say more than half of the funding, to bring Théâtre du Rêve over to Paris, France to perform.
How did that performance go?
It was wildly different every night. So that's a very good question. Our very first night, opening night, the audience was very quiet, a very different kind of what we call in French écoute. And the director warned us of this. He said Americans tend to be ready to laugh at anything, laugh uproariously, respond verbally or with their breath. And he said the French tend to be much, much more reserved. And it doesn't mean they're not listening, they're not with you, they're just more reserved. And he called it an écoute glaciale. So kind of like a glacier, like an icy way of listening. But we had a reception after with the opening night audience, and they all really enjoyed it and had very intelligent things to say about the show, really striking questions, and had been moved by the experience. So I guess the fact that they were quiet didn't necessarily mean that they weren't with us on the show. Now the second night, the house was filled with an uproariously loud audience. They were laughing all the time. They were with us. At one point, I thought it was because there were a few Americans in the audience that they would have initiated the laughter. But afterwards, there was another reception. I come out into the lobby, and there were a group of French women, probably 65, 70, and I said, oh, so you were a really responsive audience. Was it because there were Americans in the audience? And they said, absolutely not. We started the laughter, and they insisted that it was because of them. And the way that they listened to the show, that the laughter was there and that the responses were there.
Were the audiences primarily French then?
Predominantly French, although there were a number of, there's an American program, a Sweetbriar program in France, and some Americans that we had known had been traveling in France or had second homes in France. So they came to see the show as well. So it was a really good mix, really good
How
mix.
did you feel the mood of Paris and the French generally towards the Americans in the troupe, and just when you were there at the at the theater or in Paris itself?
I actually arrived in Paris before we started working on the piece a few days before Barack Obama was elected. So his picture was everywhere. The French were so pro-Obama that they were, you know, you could feel that the tension and the excitement in the air and saying, is this a different America on the horizon? Is this a new, is this a new wave, a new trend? Will we have a different dialogue with America after this election? We hope, fingers crossed. So that's what I experienced when I first got there, and I actually ran into this woman who was Portuguese, lived in France for a number of years, and she was so upset. She thought that I hadn't voted because I arrived prior to the election, and she was really worried, and I said, no, 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 you know, I voted before I left, and she said, who did you vote for? And I just smiled, and I said, I think you might know. And she jumped up and down and took me in her arms and started kissing me and embracing me. So if that's anything about the sentiment of Americans or Europeans living in France, their opinion, their idea towards America, it had definitely shifted since the last time I had been in France. Let's see.
Having said that, nevertheless, some of the issues that are explored in the play and some of the cultural friction still remains. Mm-hmm. While there may be a closer surface relationship now with the change in administration and so forth, it's still France and it's still the United States.
Yeah, it's interesting because the playwright and the director are both French, Belgian, Europeans, and the two of them are of my generation as well, and they've said that there's always been this love-hate relationship with America, and that these were two human beings who grew up since early childhood. Where they basically said they were bottle-fed American culture. They were, you know, in music, television, films, it was all American culture. So it's very much a part of their life and who they are, but at the same time there have been issues, political issues, that have really, you know, put a wrench or a rift between the two cultures. Issues that we address in the play that deal with extremism or racism, or extremism is perhaps too harsh of a word, but an ideology that is pushed too hard, and people who are just kind of trapped in their own way of thinking and not willing to think outside of their own boxes. Those things, there are human beings who will always be like that, who will always have those tendencies. That has not changed. And the play did examine not only our current situation, or the situation politically when it was written in 2000, when was it written, 2003? No, 2004, excuse me, is when it was written. These things don't go away, and the play also, always in a very comic way, looked at the dark spots on both the French culture and the American culture. So those things, our dark spots don't vanish. Maybe they just are easier to deal with within the current political context.